Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Go Big, Living Tiny. My name is Frank, and today I'm chatting with someone who has dedicated her life to solving some of the deeper issues we encounter with tiny homes and affordable housing in general. Terrilee Kelford is from Perth, Ontario, and now resides in Ottawa. She earned her MA in Counseling Psychology at Yorkville University and is now the founder and CEO of Kelford Youth Services Incorporated. Terrilee's journey in life has given her some unique insights into tiny homes as a partial solution to housing, and I'm sure you'll raise your eyebrows more than once when you listen to this conversation. Are you ready? Let's get into it. Hello, Terrilee. Welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking with you today about tiny homes. So how are things in your life right now?
Busy, very busy, but good. Yeah, some good stuff happening and some good progress. And certainly, if we're talking about the world of tiny homes, there's been some good news stories in that realm as well. So, and certainly, as you're probably noticing, the conversation has exploded over the last few years. So it's good to see.
It really has. It's really no secret that the housing crisis has seen a lot more scrutiny in the past couple of years. The idea that tiny homes can be a major player in our recovery is one that's, I think, fast becoming a real possibility. You're a registered psychotherapist. You're co-chair at the National Alliance to End Rural and Remote Homelessness. I had to practice that.
It's a wordy one.
Right. And you are also chair of Cornerstone Landing Youth Services, an organization that's doing some amazing work with youth in your areas. Your resume doesn't even begin to end there. And for anyone looking in from the outside, it really looks like you've dedicated every minute of your life to solving this housing crisis we find ourselves in, probably kind of evidenced by that couch behind you with the blanket on it. So, my first question might be kind of, along the lines of like that, because you do so much work with youth services and rural homelessness, et cetera, it isn't hard to see that tiny homes and solutions to housing go hand in hand. Is that why you became interested in the tiny home industry?
Well, my background is really in working with children, but with the residential lens. And so I think the work I did historically in the child welfare system has led me to doing the work around youth homelessness, which then led me to looking at housing solutions. I don't think you can work with folks who are homeless or in need of housing without then being interested in housing. So it wasn't necessarily an intentional path, but a logical one, I think, in the sense that we have to start having these conversations about housing. And the community coalition I co-founded 22 years ago was about trying to find solutions for youth homelessness, and so that's really how it's sort of evolved. So and so here we are. I never thought I'd learn more about planning and building code than I have in the last few years, but can't say I really wanted to, but here we are. So necessary part of the conversation, I think.
The tiny home thing is kind of a new aspect of what you're doing recently. I've only just recently heard about your tiny home podcast, which was like Terrilee's doing something else again. Like she's already wearing enough hats. She's got to throw another hat on top of one of those.
Right.
So
yes.
I really wondered if there was any specific event in your life. Like where was the turnaround? What sort of, I'm already doing all this stuff. Oh, here's something else. I'm just going to go ahead and do that too. Where was that turning point?
Yeah, well, I think housing specifically, was the work that we do with Cornerstone Landing Youth Services. So Cornerstone is a small charity that works in Leonard County to support young people who are homeless between the ages of 16 and 24. We started a Housing First program about 6-7 years ago and used it quite successfully. But part of the Housing First model is to use private market housing and financial supports to support people in their own independent living situations. And so what we found, though, over time with the housing prices and the housing market was that we had to keep fundraising extra dollars every year just to pay the rents and to help with rent supplements. So, we went from $12,000 a year to $20,000 a year to almost $40,000 a year in rent supplements just to keep up with the market. And not only that, working with youth, you learn pretty quickly that lots of landlords just don't want to work with youth, period. And so we had housing caseworkers call me up and say, Terrilee, do you know, I just had a landlord hang up the phone on my ear when I said I was working with a young person. So, so we found that our options as a program to try to get young people housed became more challenging with the house prices. And so we started having a conversation with Algonquin College years ago. I say years ago, but really about 5-6 years ago, about trying to find a model where we could have students at the college build houses. And so we are lucky to have a campus in Leonard County in Perth, in the town of Perth, Algonquin College campus, that had a trades program around construction and heritage building and those sorts of pieces. And so we were having conversations with the college to say, how could we set up a program where your students are building a housing unit every year? And so they couldn't really pull off a 3-bedroom house at the time. So the conversation really started to become about tiny houses. And so lots of our young people were living in room rentals and bachelor units anyway. So a tiny house wasn't that far off for a lot of these young people. And so we wanted to look at having the students build 1 unit every year, and then we treat it kind of like Lego was the original model. We'll just keep adding pieces. Unfortunately, the college had to close their trades program for construction. So just before we were getting ready to solidify a program model, unfortunately, we had to sort of cancel that idea. But we were able to pull together some funding pieces, some grants collectively, and do some fundraising in our community to be able to do what we call the pilot project. So we built our first tiny home on a trailer, which was a brand new journey for any of us. We hired a private builder. So we weren't able to get students to build the tiny home. We actually hired a private builder, but the college was involved all the way through. And the college had a grant to look at low carbon building. So that was really their goal from it. And my goal, my personal / agency goal, was to really challenge some of the stereotypes I was hearing about tiny homes at the time. And so I was going around and meeting with planners and trying to have discussions with building inspectors and folks to really get at the root issue as to why tiny homes were so tough to get on the ground and what the stereotypes and backlash sort of were to the concept of tiny homes. So, and I heard all kinds of things just as recently as 4 or 5 years ago, like, well, the minimum square footage requirements for homes is 600 square feet. I'm like, nope, it's not. It's 145.36 plus a bathroom or something like that. So, and so it was one of the first emails I got from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs in Ontario from the Building Code Department was, can you please put in writing what the minimum square footage requirement is for a house? So, and I actually use that in my conversations then. But there was a lot of stereotypes about tiny homes on trailers. Like I think another one I heard was you can't build a house on a trailer that'll last longer than 10 years. It'll just fall apart. So we went about with this project with Algonquin to kind of challenge some of these stereotypes and to build a tiny home to Ontario building code standards, like a regular house on a trailer. So that's really what we did with this project. So sadly, our house has been sitting vacant for 2.5 years, but we did manage to pull off building a house, probably higher standards actually than minimum building code standards for a house, but it's in a beautiful little place.
We have actually followed you a little on social media through that struggle, and I get the impression that you didn't really post all of the struggle, just no. Things that weren't, overly disastrous for the most part, but you could tell, I mean, that it really was a struggle, because your struggle mirrors so many other people's struggle when it comes down to building. What do I build and where do I put it? The answers to those questions come out of the code and come out of the legal documents that people produce so that you can put a house somewhere and build it a certain way. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you've been just made aware recently of the work of Janet in the United States for ASTM ISO rulings for tiny homes.
Right. Yeah.
And that's also being brought up into Canada via BC. There's a group that Pamela Robertson from Sunshine Tiny Homes is a part of. Tiny Home Alliance Canada, we support them. We don't do any work with them specifically, but we do support them. And they're bringing those sorts of rules. So you don't have to say, make an analog for it. Say, oh, I want to get this tiny home approved, so here's your analog for it. It shouldn't be like that. You shouldn't need to have an analog for it. It should have its own set of regulations. Do you think the tiny home industry will see with these regulations coming in, do you think the tiny home industry will see any kind of major growth from that, like a growth spurt, as it were?
Well, it's an interesting conversation. So because the Ontario Building Code has now changed as of January 1st, 2022. And the way I'll speak to the Ontario Code because that's the conversations I have the most about. I mean, there are CSA standards in Canada as well. So Canadian Safety Association standards, right? And so modular homes or mobile homes are approved under that standard. So CSA could be as well looking at coming up with regulations around tiny homes as well. But I think what people have to remember is that when CSA gets involved, it means you need a CSA approval to build a tiny home. Or if a safety standard gets involved, you have to build within that safety standard. And most times layman's people can't do that. So in Ontario, for example, to build modular housing, you have to be a factory. And if you're a factory, you add $5,000 to $6,000 per unit of housing to the cost of being a home manufacturer and all the licensing requirements. So I'm less interested in safety standards and regulations around tiny homes than I am for people to be finding ways and pathways for them to be able to build their own tiny house. Because I think that's the only way we're going to actually get affordable housing out of tiny homes. Because I think the more regulations involved, the more approvals involved, the more licensing involved, the more costs involved. And so I want to actually allow homeowners themselves to be able to build tiny homes. It's not to say that both can't align side by side, just like modular housing does with regular housing.
That's exactly where I was going in my mind, right there. Can they not align in some way? Because they both have their advantages. Both, both things should work in tandem, realistically.
They can, yeah. And I think what was missing in Ontario, which is why I was so excited about the changes to the Ontario building codes, that there was no mechanism for a private homeowner to build their own tiny house. So, and there is now. And so that's really what I wanted to see, because again, that is one of the ways that people have, it's a mechanism they have to keep things affordable, is if you can remove the labor costs, if you can build your own house, right? So if you have to hire a builder or go through a home manufacturer, you're increasing your costs right off the top. And that's becomes less and less affordable.
Do you think it's just, and this is just coming off the top of my head all of a sudden, do you think someone like you who's had the experience with rural homelessness, you've had some experience now building a tiny home, you kind of understand the pitfalls that are involved and how to get around them, would it not be then beneficial or even cost effective to go out and buy some land and build a tiny home village that then you can run in your own way, and that village would then sort of be a boon and be an asset to your other organizations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've done a bit of a smaller model with Cornerstone. So timing wise, the province in Ontario changed their Provincial Planning Act to encourage municipalities, or to actually require municipalities, to approve 2 secondary units or additional dwelling units or residential dwelling units. They've had different acronyms now for the last few years, but essentially we bought a house in Perth just in December 2020. We were really excited, our first house for a very small charity. And we used the main house for 3 transitional units of housing. So temporary housing up to a year where people can come and find affordable rents and save some money and move on to longer term housing from there. And we turned an addition at the back of the house into a 1-bedroom apartment. So it should be done in the next week or 2. And then we tore down a bunch of very unattractive sheds to be able to hopefully use our tiny home in there as a bachelor unit. So essentially we have a single family home, which doesn't look any different than any other house on the block. And we're going to have a 1-bedroom apartment on the back and a bachelor unit in the backyard. And we've improved the look of the property. And we think also then improved people's property values, because it's always one of the big concerns around tiny homes. But it's a really good residential model and a way to incorporate tiny homes into this discussion about affordable housing in different ways. The tiny home village is a hot conversation right now, obviously, because people want as many tiny homes as possible. They want as many housing units as possible.
And there are several companies in Canada actually pursuing that. Tiny Town Association not being the least of them. There are several that are pursuing that very goal.
Yeah, so there's very few actually who've been able to follow through, though, and I think Homes for Heroes is one of the best models, right? So Dr. John Rook was involved in the programming aspect of the Homes for Heroes project in Edmonton and Calgary, and he actually flew out to see our tiny home when it was being built in Perth, actually, and I was able to do a tour with him back in Edmonton. Actually, I flew out to see in Calgary. I went out for a conference in Edmonton and flew over to Calgary and did a tour of the Homes for Heroes very first tiny home village they had there. And really cool unit, really neat concept. They're all on foundations, which makes it a little easier than having to navigate the whole trailer discussion. But they essentially took 3 standard housing lots and put them together and built 15 units of housing plus a common space and an office space. So really good example of how you can make 15 units of housing out of 3 lots that were for single family homes before, right? So
I think they're showing something really fundamentally important, and something that I don't think sort of gets brought to the fore enough, is that living tiny, for some people, it's a lifestyle choice. But for those of us who don't have a roof over our head at all, better living small than not at all. Really,
right? Yeah.
So I get a lot of people saying, the space thing. Where do I put all my stuff? Where do I put all my stuff? And I can't just help but shake my head and think, think
Mhm.
internally, you're not the right person for this industry, if that's what you're thinking.
Yeah, and that's a really multi-layered conversation. I've worked with kids in the child welfare system, and their stuff is really important to them because they've been moved around a lot, right? And so it's really important for us to keep their stuff. And so whatever that is, boxes of whatever it is, right? And so it's so depending on which way you look at that, it's a really interesting dynamic. I agree, tiny homes are not for everybody, and they're not meant to be. Tiny homes are not going to solve the homelessness problem. It's going to be a combination of factors, as we just saw in the discussion that's evolving out of the federal budget that was just released. It's multi-layered, but I think they can play a role, and I think that's been my position since the beginning, is that they're not going to solve homelessness, but they can definitely play a role. And in fact, I think it's also important, I try to say this every time I talk about tiny homes, that they're not a new concept. They're an old concept that we ruled out through legislation over the years. And there's a few factors about tiny houses too. I mean, the other thing we don't talk about very often is that, most homeowners move 4 to 5 times in their lifetime now. They buy and sell houses, they buy their starter home, and then they move to a family home, and then they move to retirement size house, they downsize, they move. And so it's not uncommon to move. So there's nothing wrong with a tiny home also being a starter home for folks. And we've really kind of lost the starter home content out of our housing portfolio now in terms of
right
Canada,
about
right?
that. Yeah.
Yeah. So the house prices are so high now, there is no such thing as a starter home. And so we need to go back to some of these old models we had, like wartime housing, right? So these wartime houses, strawberry box houses that were built right across the country, were seen as starter homes for a lot of people. And
go down some streets in Toronto,
Yeah, they're in every small town here in Leonard County. I've taken pictures of them and posted them online to say this is tiny homes. So, and over over the years through planning legislation, we actually made those types of housing units illegal because we applied these minimum square footage requirements for homes like 1,000 square feet, and so it was illegal to build a tiny house.
A stigma gets put over top of that, and then
yeah,
people become in despair before you even try to start fixing the problem. Like, oh, well, there's no legislation. No, I can't put it anywhere, and then.
Yeah. And I've had a few conversations with a variety of professionals from different backgrounds to try to figure out why that is over time. And I think there's a few factors. I think taxes and municipalities, obviously, the bigger the house, the higher the tax base you get. Per door units I've heard about from local elected officials. I think also NIMBYism started to apply as well, right? People wanted bigger is better, kind of became the mantra for housing in Canada. And house sizes went from, the average 1,000 square feet to 2,400 square feet in Canada over the last 25 years. Don't quote me on that stat. It's close to that.
No, but you're right. In the past few decades, really, like, tiny homes is actually something that was, prevalent in the world, in history, and, all of life. It was, you build as much as you want, you don't build more. It only really started, especially in our countries, in these developed countries, in the last 100, 75, 100 years, where people started having enough money left over to start building bigger houses because they have more stuff, and then you build a bigger house. Mm-hmm. And that's where the whole starter house thing comes. You start off together, but then you have so much stuff. Oh, honey, we need a bigger couch. Oh, well, we have 2 incomes now. We can buy a bigger. So then it all just, it's sort of natural.
Yeah.
It's organic that it follows that. But it's not how we feel like it's always been this way, but it really, in history shows that we've always lived in small places. We've never really accumulated as many things as we do in these days, in this day.
Yeah. At the same time as, Canadian households become smaller. So we're getting bigger houses with smaller families.
Smaller families.
Yeah. And so, I mean, if you're looking even at environmental impacts, right, we've got, these great big, huge footprints of houses with very few people living in them.
Yeah, we've got kids with their own big rooms and their own double bathrooms, and they've got basically their own little suite up in this big house where there's a kid, a mom and a dad and a dog, and just 5,000 square feet, so they don't have to associate with each other when they don't want to.
Right. Yes.
It's awful in a way. I mean, it's destroying the idea of community, which is something I really like the tiny home community about. Is that tiny home enthusiasts in general are also community enthusiasts. They're also people that believe in, having your own space, but wanting to be outside with your neighbors in a sense,
Yeah, I think you started to mention something earlier too about size of housing and, how it's just not for some people. But I also think when the tiny home conversations started to happen that I was involved in 4 or 5 years ago, what I heard continually from people was this fear that if tiny homes were the solution, then people who were of lower economic brackets were going to be forced into tiny homes in tiny situations as sort of the only solution to housing or homelessness. And so, you know, I'm a big believer in choice. I support housing first. And one of the fundamental aspects of housing first is choice in housing, choice in neighborhoods, choice in community. And so, again, I think it's really important to continue to say that tiny homes are not going to solve homelessness, but they're going to play a significant role. And I think we're now starting to see the conversation evolve more around emergency housing in tiny homes, which I think will be really interesting to see how it plays out, because my interest has always been in legal pathways to tiny homes and finding, you know, where the gaps are, where the loops are, and trying to plug those holes so that people can find more legal pathways to use tiny homes, including tiny homes on trailers. So there's going to be some interesting conversations, I think, evolve over the next few years around emergency villages for homelessness, because you're often talking about sleep cabins, which are a different type of accommodation through the Ontario Building Code or Building Code, that don't have plumbing or wiring. And then there's also planning implications, right? And I haven't really seen one yet that has really clearly laid a pathway for those obstacles to be consistently jumped to enable this type of model.
Everybody wants to help the homeless, but nobody wants the things there that would help them.
Yeah, and we have some really interesting models evolving. Obviously, Kitchener has had a tiny home emergency housing project operating for the last couple of years. And I believe, I don't want to talk about this specifically, but I think they started out sort of as an illegal encampment in cabins, but they've now been approved to be there, I believe. And Vancouver is now looking at, there's an emergency shelter there that's now looking as an extension of their shelter to have tiny homes as well, which will be, again, a really interesting model to follow, because we always need examples. We need leaders who kind of get these projects off the ground, who can then carve out sort of the pathways for others to be able to follow. We need planning examples, right? I mean, in Ontario, for example, the only zoning bylaw I've seen in all of the province is with Leeds and 1000 Islands, where they've actually created a bylaw specifically for tiny homes on trailers now, which is brilliant, because I'm showing it to every other planner I speak to, because it's something that could be modeled in all the other municipalities to make it that much easier for people to be able to use tiny homes on trailers as an option as well. But again, it takes the first all the time. And the first is very painful, as we learned with our tiny house. So trying to be the first to use a tiny home and a trailer as an affordable housing unit for youth has been a painful process for sure. But I like to think after 2.5 years, we are getting closer.
I think a lot of that there's so much more work. You know, COVID really, as tragic as it was for a lot of things, it was one of those things like war in some cases, where it sort of directs your focus some way to the important things. And a lot of companies, I don't know if it's because I've gotten myself into the industry or not, but I've noticed it, like owning a VW Beetle. I see VW Beetles everywhere now. And so it's the same thing here. I'm seeing so many organizations at least trying. Some will succeed, some will fail. Some will just sort of get in there in the middle, but you know that there's so many trying. It shows the focus on housing in different ways: container homes, tiny homes, printed homes, just you know, the shelters for homeless, you know, all the way up through the gamut of that stuff. It gives me a lot of hope that you know, that a drop can indeed fill an ocean. And so if everybody puts in their drop and enough drops get in there, we'll overwhelm the forces against us, and there's no holding that back. So I wanted to give you a chance here to also plug your own tiny home podcast, the one you're co-hosting there. You know, so tell us about this most recent endeavor of yours, Tiny Home Talk Canada.
Yeah, well, there's not much to tell at this point, because I was hoping to launch in April, but of course my personal work life has just taken over. So we're probably going to push it back to May. Part of the intention of it really is just to share the information that we've learned. So I get calls or emails, probably 2, 3, 4, 5 a week, from different people asking about tiny homes. Everything from, I'm looking at buying this house, it's $25,000, should I buy it? To, you know, to folks who are looking to get a tiny home village off the ground, or just questions around the model in general. And so for me, it would be great, selfishly, if I had a location where I could say, go and listen to this conversation, because that will teach you about the planning. Go and listen to this conversation, because it'll talk you through the building code aspects. So I'm hoping it's going to be more of a source for folks to go and get really tangible information that they need to make an informed decision. It's something I really believed in strongly. I was honored to be invited to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing consultation around the tiny home guide that was created in Ontario. It's a really good resource for folks looking in Ontario about tiny homes. It could be used in the other provinces as well. And so one of the things I really wanted to make clear with the ministry was that at that time, there was no legal pathway to building a tiny home and a trailer to be used for housing. And as much as it seemed at the time to me, when I first got into this conversation about tiny homes and trailers, it seemed like everybody had them everywhere. And so if you looked up, websites, you'd see, oh, tiny homes all across Canada. And then you look them up and they're actually all illegal, essentially, because there really was no pathway within the building code to allow people to actually build their own tiny home. So if somebody was building a tiny home in their backyard and sold it to somebody else, it really was never going to be allowed to be used for legal housing for some folks. So, and I really started to worry about that because I had some really sad stories, from people who would call up and say, hey, I'm wanting to get out of this abusive situation. I see an ad for a $25,000 house. Where could I put it and where could I use it? And sadly, I would say you can't. So it's going to be nearly impossible for you to use that house if it wasn't inspected. And there's very few locations where you can actually park them now to live in year round. So, but at the same time, I thought it was really important to make sure the public knows that the last thing we need is people with very little funds wasting them on a house with the idea that they're going to be able to use them and then can't. So I think it's really important to get those messages out there. And then also to inform the public about what the legal pathways are. Don't get me wrong. I've had people come here and have a conversation with me for an hour or two about tiny homes and leave and say, I'm going to do it illegally then. I can't jump all these hoops. I don't have the money to do it. So if they choose to do that, that's totally up to them. But I'd rather they know going in that that's what they're choosing to do, and to, kind of a buyer beware situation. So because I don't like to hear about people being exploited, and not necessarily even exploited, but just unknowingly buying something that then becomes unusable for them. So that's really what the podcast is about. That's a long-winded way of saying what the podcast is about, is really trying to get tangible information into people's hands about choices and pathways for tiny homes. Something we're going to be ironing out too with ours next is the issue around foundations and trailers and how all that's going to work for tiny homes and trailers. So we've hired a structural engineer and we're working with a company to design the foundation for us, or the anchors for us. And so we'll be happy to share all that information as well for folks, because I think that's kind of the next step, is how do you get around those hurdles too. But yeah, we're closer, and I'm hoping that the podcast just becomes a place to share that information for folks.
I really do too. And we'll definitely, Tiny Home Alliance, we're definitely behind you 100%. And we'll definitely share you all over the place, and hopefully we'll have you on again, maybe in a few months, and see where things are going, kind of thing. Yeah, I kind of wanted to close things off a little bit by just seeing what advice you might have for somebody who's listened to all this, all the way through this podcast, all the way through this interview. And what advice would you have for somebody who's suddenly they weren't interested when they first came in, and now they're like, I think we can do this. What is your advice for them starting out?
Oh boy. I don't have short answers to these questions.
It never is.
I think if people are interested in tiny homes, do your research and inform yourself first. So make an educated decision. Like I said, if you choose to, find a piece of land out in the middle of nowhere and park your tiny home and live there off the grid, that's totally your choice. But I do think that you need to know that before you spend $20, $30, $40, $50,000 on a house that you'll never be able to legally live in year round. So inform yourself, get the information, it's out there. If you're looking at a specific municipality, do not be afraid to just pick up the phone and call and ask for the planner or the building inspector, and just ask the questions. Just ask them. That's what they're there for. They'll be happy to do it, because the last thing they want is for someone to be getting fines for parking a trailer illegally on some property somewhere. So call the planner, call the building department, ask them in the specific municipality you're in. I do think there's going to be more and more changes and more bylaws in place and more examples to be able to use. So don't be afraid to ask, because I think also municipalities need to know that there is a desire for these housing units there. I've been to municipal planning meetings all around Leonard County, and I've been in the room sometimes with 5 or 6 other people interested in tiny homes in the room that I didn't even know they're going to be there. So there is a huge interest in these homes, and I think municipalities and elected officials need to know that people want them. And so don't be afraid to call the municipality and ask.
Just get everybody talking.
Yeah.
And that one phrase, that sort of speaks to the last two years. Do your research.
Do your research. Yeah. Be informed.
Don't be lazy. Don't expect the internet and Google to tell you everything you want to know. Go and do some real, go and look into what you're doing. And that's probably the best advice I've heard on this channel so far. And so that's great advice. So, well, we're going to end at that. I want to thank you so much for being here with us today, Terrilee. Your work is amazing. We love that you're out there trying to make the world a better place. And the more people like you around, the better. And so we wish you all great success in everything you're doing.
Thank you very much.
And to everyone else, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and do the likes and all that wonderful stuff. Make sure you support Tiny Home Alliance Canada on Patreon if you want to watch more videos like this and listen to more interesting interviews. The links are all in the comments. And remember, go big, living tiny. Thanks, everyone.